For as long as we've had history class, we've been told the same simple story. The pyramids are tombs, giant gravestones for ego-driven pharaohs. But what if that's not true? What if those 3 stone mountains on the edge of Sahara aren't the start of civilization, but the last surviving memory of a much older one? Not proof of our rise, but proof that we've already fallen once before. Because out there, just outside Cairo, under that brutal desert sun, sits a piece of geometry that honestly shouldn't exist. 3 pyramids, each one made of roughly 2 million stone blocks. Individual blocks that can weigh as much as a truck, set with such insane precision that in some places you can't slide a razor blade between them. No mortar. No, close enough. Just perfect. Their sides are aligned almost exactly to true north, south, east, and west. Not kind of close. Not eyeballed. Mathematically locked to the cardinal directions with precision we struggle to recreate today without GPS and lasers. And then, guarding the whole plateau like some ancient glitch in the simulation, sits the Sphinx. Half lion, half human, all mystery. We're told it's about 4,500 years old. Old Kingdom, 4th Dynasty. Standard textbook stuff. But here's the problem. The stone isn't listening to the textbook. When geologists, people who study rock, not pharaohs, look at the Sphinx, they see something Egyptology doesn't want to talk about. The body of the Sphinx and the walls of the pit it's carved down into are deeply weathered, not by wind and sand, but by water. Deep vertical channels, rounded wave shapes in the limestone. Exactly what you get when heavy rainfall is pounding down for centuries. Egypt today gets almost no rain. Less than an inch a year in that region. And that's been true for a long time. Long before the pharaohs. So either the Sphinx spent thousands of years in a climate that doesn't exist anymore, or the weather patterns over Giza did a magic trick just for that one statue and then stopped forever. Now add another weird piece. Astronomers noticed something odd about the layout of the pyramids. The 3 big ones at Giza form a diagonal, but the smallest one is slightly offset. That same pattern appears in the sky. Look up at Orion's belt. 3 bright stars in a line. 2 straight, one nudged a little off to the side. When you overlay the pyramids on those stars, the match is spooky. But here's where it gets really uncomfortable. That alignment, the pyramids mirroring Orion's belt, fits best not in 2500 BC, when we're told they were built, but way earlier, around 12,000 years ago. That date keeps popping up again and again like a glitch in the Matrix. Because 12,000 years ago, something very bad happened to Earth. Geologists call it the Younger Dryas. You can think of it as the planet slamming on the brakes. The Ice Age was ending. Climates were warming. Ice sheets were retreating. And then suddenly, the temperature crashed again. Glaciers surged back. Rain patterns changed. Entire ecosystems broke. The leading theory? A fragmented comet or asteroid slammed into the northern hemisphere, probably into the massive ice sheets covering North America and parts of Europe. Not one big dinosaur killer rock, but a swarm of icy bullets. The impacts would have vaporized huge volumes of ice, thrown ash, dust, and steam into the sky, triggered global wildfires, shut down ocean currents that control climate, sent meltwater surges roaring into the oceans. Sea levels rose, coast drowned, forests burned, the climate whiplashed, species disappeared. Big animals, mammoths, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, vanished in a geological blink. Human populations crashed, cultures collapsed, and yet, through all of that, the pyramids and Sphinx, if they were already there, stood exactly where they still stand today. Silent, precise, completely out of place. So we have to ask the question no official textbook really wants to touch. Were the builders of Giza survivors? Not primitive farmers just figuring out how to stack stones, but descendants of a far older, more advanced culture that was almost erased by ice, by fire, and by water? A civilization that watched its cities vanish under rising seas and encroaching desert and decided, we're going to leave something behind they can't erase. Something in bedrock. Something that could ride out 10, 20, 50,000 years of chaos. Stone, When you zoom out from the pyramids themselves and look at the landscape they sit in, another layer of the story appears. Today we see endless sand. Dry, dead, hostile. The mental picture most of us have of Egypt is heat haze and dunes. But satellite data, especially from NASA's radar mapping missions, shows something very different hiding beneath that sand. Fossil rivers. Ancient channels cut into the bedrock. Dry, but still visible from orbit. Ghost waterways that once braided across North Africa, like veins. One of them, the Tamanrasset River, would have been enormous. Think, a river system flowing from deep in the Sahara out toward the Atlantic, with a delta the size of modern Egypt. Another branch, more recently mapped, flows close to the area of Giza itself. It's been nicknamed the Aramat, meaning pyramids in Arabic, because its fossil course passes right by the plateau where those monuments now stand. 12,000 years ago, this wasn't a wasteland. It was grassland, wetlands, lakes, a green corridor from the Red Sea to the Atlantic. We find pollen from trees and grasses that need regular rain, fossil hippos, crocodiles, and freshwater fish buried in what is now pure desert, rock art deep in Sahara showing giraffes, antelope, cattle, even people swimming. This period has a name, the African Humid Period. A time when the monsoon shifted north and turned the Sahara into a giant savanna dotted with lakes and rivers. A time when human groups lived, hunted, fished, and maybe built things along shorelines that are now buried under hundreds of feet of sand. And then the younger Dryas hits. The rains falter. The climate flips. The green Sahara starts to die. Lakes shrink and vanish. Rivers dry up. Grasslands fade back into sand. Imagine being there for that. Imagine watching the lake your family has fished for generations retreat year after year until it's a salt pan. Seeing animals vanish, trees wither, dust storms grow more frequent, and realizing this isn't a bad season. This is the end of your world. At that point, you have two choices. Stay and die with the land, or move. For people scattered across North Africa, there was one obvious lifeline left. The Nile, fed by rains far to the south. The Nile kept flowing even as the Sahara turned back into desert. It became a green ribbon through a dying continent, a natural refuge. If anyone was going to carry high-level knowledge forward, astronomy, geometry, large-scale stone building, it would be the people who made it to the river. If monumental structures existed before the cataclysm, most of them are gone now. Coastal cities are underwater. Inland cities are under dunes. Anything built from mud brick or timber has returned to dust. Only three kind of things could survive. Structures carved directly into bedrock. Monuments built on high, stable ground. Stone complexes in ultra-dry regions where erosion is minimal. Sound familiar? The core of the Great Pyramid is locked into the limestone plateau itself. The Sphinx is carved directly out of a rocky outcrop and surrounded by a trench cut into solid stone. Both sit high and dry above the old floodplains, which means they fit the profile, not of early experiments in stone, but of survivors. Monuments that made it through transition from green world to desert, while almost everything else that culture built was erased. When we stand at Giza today, it looks like the beginning of something, but maybe it's actually the end of something else. The last intact chapter of a story mostly lost to flood, drought, and time. And if that's true, then to understand who built these things, we can't just look at the pharaohs. We have to rewind. Back to the green Sahara. Back to a world of rivers where there is now only sand. Back to the climate that could carve the Sphinx and the catastrophe that turned its rain-soaked walls into a fossilized memory of a world that died. If we want to understand why Giza exists at all, we have to forget the Egypt we know and picture a completely different world. Not sand. Not endless beige, but water. Let's start from space. When NASA flew its shuttle radar topography mission over North Africa, the radar didn't just map mountains and valleys. It also peeled back the dunes and revealed what's hiding underneath. Ancient river systems, fossil channels, ghost waterways, carved deep into the bedrock and then buried under thousands of years of sand. One of the biggest is called the Tamanrasset system. Imagine a river flowing out of the middle of the Sahara, wide, deep, powerful, running westward and dumping into the Atlantic in a delta roughly the size of modern Egypt. This wasn't a trickle. This was a continental artery. Closer to home, near the Nile and the Giza Plateau, scientists identified another major ancient river branch, often called the Aramat in modern work. Its course threads right through the region where the pyramids stand today. The name Aramat in Arabic is associated with pyramids. It's like the desert itself is whispering what used to be here. 12,000 years ago, this was not a barren wasteland. It was alive. Think of a massive green corridor stretching from the Red Sea all the way to the Atlantic coast. Rolling grasslands, wetlands and shallow lakes, clusters of trees and scattered forests, herds of gazelle, antelope, and wild cattle, elephants and giraffes roaming where now there is only dust. And, of course, people, not a couple of wandering families, whole communities. We know this because of what's left behind. Scientists drill cores out of ancient lake beds and find pollen from plants that can only grow in wetter climates, acacia, wild grasses, even fig and other trees that crave water and decent soil. They dig in the western desert and pull out the bones of hippos and crocodiles, along with freshwater fish fossils. Hippos and crocs are not desert animals. They don't survive in a little puddle after it rains. They need permanent water, rivers, lakes, wetlands. So what you're looking at is not fantasy. It's not maybe, possibly, could have been. It's data. The Sahara we think of as the world's largest desert used to be a patchwork of savanna and lakes. Geologists call that whole stretch of time the African humid period. Monsoon systems had shifted northward. The jet stream was in a different position. And year after year, summer rains pushed deep into what is now the heart of the Sahara. This wasn't a brief fluke. It lasted thousands of years. And humans were definitely there to see it. Deep inside the desert, in places you can only reach after days of travel across empty rock and sand, there are caves and rock shelters whose walls are covered in art. At Tassili Jur in southern Algeria, we find thousands of engravings and paintings. Giraffes grazing under trees. Big herds of antelope moving across open plains. People swimming in what looks like rivers or lakes. Hunters with bows, spears, and even what look like boats. At Gilf Kabir on Egypt's far western edge, we see similar scenes. Dancing figures, cattle herds, water everywhere. These ancient artists weren't drawing myths. They were sketching their reality. They lived in a Sahara that still breathed. Now imagine you're born into that world. Your whole life is water and grass and migration. You follow the rains, the herds, the lakes. You tell stories about which stars mean time to move, or the river will rise soon. You notice patterns in the sky. You learn to time your journeys by the position of Orion or Sirius or certain bright stars along the horizon. You build shrines, maybe stone markers, maybe simple standing stones, to track where the sun rises at certain times of year. Nothing as massive as a pyramid yet, but the seed is there. The idea that the land and the sky are a calendar. And then everything starts to break. Around 12,900 years ago, the big climate glitch hits. The Younger Dryas. From the perspective of a human living through it, it's not a subtle shift in isotopic ratios in ice cores. It's this. The rains that always came stop. The lakes you grew up fishing and start shrinking. Year after year, the shoreline creeps inward. Shallow bays become muddy flats. Mud turns to cracked earth. Animals begin to vanish. The herds are thinner. The migrations fail. Springs that were always reliable go dry. The seasons feel wrong. The storms you were counting on never arrive. At first, it's easy to believe you're just having a run of bad years. But at some point, the older people, those who remember the way it used to be, realize something far more serious is happening. Not a drought, a transition. The grasslands fade. Dust storms increase. Farms, if they existed, get harder to maintain. Hunting yields drop. People start moving. First a little, then a lot. A wave of migration begins. And if you're in North Africa, the logical direction is east, toward the one river that refuses to die, the Nile. Fed by rains falling far to the south, the Nile doesn't depend on the local climate around Giza. Even as the Sahara dries, that river just keeps flowing northward, flooding its banks, leaving behind rich black silt. Follow the dead rivers, and they eventually funnel you toward the one that's still alive. Archaeologists actually see this in the data. Settlement density along the Nile begins to rise right around the time the rest of the Sahara is collapsing, which raises a powerful possibility. The people who ended up clustered along the Nile after the African humid period weren't just simple desert refugees. They were the survivors of a once thriving green world. They carried with them memories of vast lakes long gone, stories of a sky that shifted and a climate that failed, knowledge of animal husbandry, navigation, and stars, symbols and rituals born in caves and rock shelters across the old wet Sahara. And maybe they carried something else, a determination not to be erased. Think about it from their point of view. You've just watched your world die. You've lost land, animals, probably friends and family. Your old routes and sacred places are disappearing under sand. You know in your bones that nothing is permanent. So what do you leave behind? What can you build that cannot be easily washed away, burned, or buried? Not villages, they're fragile. Not stories alone. Those can dissolve in a few generations. You build in bedrock. You carve into the bones of the earth itself. You choose a stable plateau above the floodplain, a place the Nile cannot easily swallow. You anchor your work to the limestone foundation, and you build big enough that even if everything else you ever knew gets erased, this will remain. The Sphinx, carved straight out of the limestone ridge, sunk into its own protective trench. The pyramids, locked into that same bedrock, their cores fused to the plateau, structures that could ride out floods, drought, shifting sand, even massive climate swings. And here's an ironic twist. The very thing that killed their world is what preserved their memory. Desert. Extreme dryness is like nature's hard drive. It doesn't rot wood or paper as quickly. It slows decay. It protects. Archaeologists have a term for this weird contradiction. The paradox of preservation. The same conditions that are hostile to life are perfect for preserving the traces of life. That's why papyrus, paint, and even mummies can survive thousands of years in Egyptian tombs. The desert kills almost everything, except the past. So when you stand at Giza today, you're not looking at man's triumph over nature. You're looking at the wreckage of nature's retreat. You're seeing the last few indestructible relics of a much greener, wetter world. Fossils of human intention, locked in stone. Science is slowly catching up to what the myths have hinted at all along. Egypt didn't appear out of nowhere. It grew out of cycles, of climate, of destruction, of rebirth. Before the golden age of pharaohs, there was a green age of rivers and lakes. Before the desert swallowed the Sahara, people hunted, painted, watched the stars, and maybe even raised early monuments there. And when that age died, a few of its children followed the last river east and started carving their memories into stone. So before we ask, who built the pyramids? We need to ask a deeper question. What kind of world could give birth to something like Giza? And what kind of catastrophe could erase almost all trace of that world? Except for a lion-bodied riddle and 3 limestone mountains still standing against the sky? We'll zoom in on that lion next. The sun climbs, tourists gather, cameras click, and almost everyone stares straight at the Sphinx's face. The human head, the broken nose, the inscrutable half-smile. But if you really want to hear what the Sphinx is saying, you don't look at the face. You look at the walls around it. Because the Sphinx doesn't sit on top of the plateau like a normal statue. It's carved down into the bedrock, inside a big rectangular pit. Almost like someone quarried a ship out of solid stone and then never moved it. Those walls are the original surface of the plateau. And they're not smooth. They're scalloped, wavy, cut by deep vertical grooves. Imagine standing down there and running your hand along the rock. It doesn't feel like it's been sandblasted horizontally by wind, like most cliffs in a desert environment. It feels like something once flowed down it again and again, carving soft limestone over centuries. That something is water. In 1991, a geologist named Dr. Robert Schoch from Boston University came to Giza, not as an Egyptologist, not as a fanboy of pharaohs, but as a rock expert. He specializes in how stone weathers over time, what rain does, what wind does, what different climates do to different types of rock. He walks into the Sphinx enclosure, looks at those walls, and goes, this doesn't match 4,500 years of desert. He sees deep vertical fissures, rounded, wave-like undulations, patterns consistent with long-term, heavy rainfall erosion. Wind erosion, what we'd expect in Egypt's current climate, makes shallow, horizontal striations as sand hits the surface and wears it down layer by layer. Rain erosion cuts downward, following gravity, widening cracks and soft layers, creating those characteristic melted shapes. On top of that, the Sphinx and its enclosure are carved from a specific type of limestone called a Mokattam Formation. It's layered like a cake. Some layers are hard and dense, others are soft and crumbly. When heavy rain hits this stuff for a long time, it doesn't just smooth it, it eats into the weaker layers, leaving a fluted, wave-cut profile. Schock compares the Sphinx enclosure to other limestone formations around Egypt and the eastern Sahara that did experience heavy rain in the distant past. The match is clear. In simple terms, the Sphinx has been rained on. A lot, more than the last 5,000 years of Egyptian weather can possibly explain. So Schock does what scientists do. He asks, okay, when was this place wet enough? To answer that, you have to zoom way out. Between roughly 14,800 and 5,500 BCE, North Africa wasn't the desert we know. It went through that African humid period we talked about. Massive climate shift. Earth's wobble and tilt changed. The monsoon moved north. Instead of dust and dunes, you had seasonal deluges, big lakes, flowing rivers, vegetation everywhere. That era makes sense for long-term rain erosion. But then you pair that with radiocarbon dates from fossil lakes, animal bones, and sediment layers, and it points towards something shocking. The Sphinx, at least the original carved body and enclosure, could have been exposed to the elements as early as 7,000 to 9,000 BC, maybe even older. That means it might predate the pharaohs by thousands of years. In other words, the pharaohs may not have created the Sphinx. They may have inherited it. Now, mainstream Egyptology did not love this. Their timeline says, First dynasties, around 3,100 BCE. Pyramids, around 2,600 to 2,500 BCE. Sphinx, around 2,500 BCE, built for the pharaoh Khafre. Their argument is based on the Sphinx being near Khafre's pyramid, a temple complex that lines up with his causeway, a resemblance between the Sphinx's face and statues of Khafre. So when a geologist comes along and suggests the Sphinx might be older than dynastic Egypt itself, the reaction is basically, if that's true, everything we've been teaching is wrong. But let's look at their evidence more closely. First, the face match. Even sculptors and architects have pointed out that the Sphinx's head is weirdly small compared to its massive body. It looks almost like an afterthought. If the Sphinx was designed all at once, you'd expect proportions to be more balanced. Instead, the head feels undersized, cramped, like it's been carved down from something bigger. Some researchers have proposed exactly that. The original Sphinx might have had a different head, possibly more lion-like, or some other form. And then, much later, someone recarved the badly eroded head into the likeness of a human ruler. That could explain the mismatch in style, the odd proportions, the connection to Khafre. He may have just been the guy who rebranded an older monument. Second, the "we don't have older texts mentioning it" argument. Egypt's written record is incredibly spotty. We act like we have this continuous story from 3000 BCE onward, but we don't. Most papyrus is gone. Many temples are destroyed. Entire archives have turned to dust. The absence of early mention of the Sphinx doesn't prove it didn't exist. It just proves we haven't found the right records, or they didn't survive. Third, there's a strange little artifact that Egyptologists tend to brush aside, the inventory stela. Discovered at Giza in the 1800s, it's a limestone slab with hieroglyphs from a later period, talking about the time of Khufu, the builder of the Great Pyramid. But here's what it says. It doesn't claim Khufu built the Sphinx. It says he found it. It talks about the house of Isis, mistress of the pyramid, beside the house of the Sphinx, as if both were already there when Khufu arrived, along with the temple. In the story, Khufu restores, repairs, honors. He doesn't construct. Now, most Egyptologists say, the stele is propaganda, it's late. It's not a reliable historical document. And sure, maybe it's embellished. But even propaganda leans on what people already believe. Why would later Egyptians invent the idea that the Sphinx was older than Khufu if everyone knew it was new in his time? Even the dream stele of Thutmose IV, placed between the Sphinx's paws around 1400 BC, tells us something. It describes the Sphinx as being buried up to its neck in sand when Thutmose was a prince. He has a dream in which the Sphinx speaks, promising him the throne if he frees it from the sand. He clears it, restores it, and becomes king. Again, he doesn't claim to have built it. He claims to have rescued it. So by Thutmose's time, more than 1,000 years after Khafre, the Sphinx is already ancient, already mysterious, already in need of restoration. It's like a reboot. Pharaoh after pharaoh returns to this weathered, half-buried relic, trying to plug themselves into its power. Geology on one side, myth and inscription on the other. Both whisper the same thing. This is older than they say. Schoch's weathering analysis doesn't give an exact birth date. Science rarely does. But it clearly points to heavy rainfall, not occasional storms. A climate that matches the African humid period, not Egypt's last 5,000 years. That pushes the Sphinx's origins back into the zone of our green Sahara survivors. And if that's true, it rewrites everything. Instead of a royal vanity project, the Sphinx becomes something else entirely. A relic, a holdover from a pre-pharaonic culture that was already losing its world. Picture that. The climate is shifting. Rains are less reliable. The lakes are shrinking. The people who've lived through generations of change realize the pattern isn't reversing this time. So they carve a guardian into the bedrock. Facing east, staring down the sunrise every day. A lion-bodied watcher, locked onto the equinox point where day and night are in perfect balance. It becomes a symbol of power, endurance, the balance between chaos and order, not for one king, for everyone who comes after. Later cultures arrive, the early Nile settlers, the proto-dynastic Egyptians, the first pharaohs. They find this colossal, weathered creature on the edge of the river valley. Do they bulldoze it? No. They adopt it. They overlay their own myths, their own gods, their own royal faces. They dig temples in front of it. They paint it. They repair it. They might even reshape the head to resemble their latest god king. But under all the recarving and plaster, the core is still older, still carved in the age of rain. The Sphinx has survived. Two completely different climate regimes. Thousands of years of sandstorms. Multiple rounds of burial and excavation. Empire after empire. And it's still here. Still staring east. Still keeping a secret most of us don't realize is even there. The secret isn't just what it represents. It's when it comes from. A time before Egypt as we know it. A time when the Sahara was green. A time when surviving meant heading toward the Nile and carving your memory into stone before the world finished drying out. So if the Sphinx is really a voice from that lost age, what is it actually saying? To answer that, we need to stop staring at the rocks and start looking at the sky. Because the builders didn't just carve into the earth. They left their message written in the stars. So we've looked down at the stone. Now it's time to look up. Because the people who carved the Sphinx and raised the pyramids weren't just obsessed with rock. They were obsessed with the sky. You don't get a complex like Giza by accident. You don't throw 2 million blocks into a pile and just happen to nail the cardinal directions within a tiny fraction of a degree. That's not random. That's someone saying, we care about orientation. North, south, east, west, earth and sky locked together. The Great Pyramid, for example, is aligned to true north with an error so small, about 3 arc minutes, that it rivals modern survey work using high-tech instruments. No compasses, no satellites, no drones. Yet somehow, thousands of years ago, someone mastered true north, not magnetic north, the arc of the sun, the movement of stars across the sky, and then baked that knowledge into stone. But the real reveal isn't in the sides. It's in the layout. On the ground, the three main pyramids of Giza form a diagonal line from northeast to southwest. But if you look closely at a map, that line isn't perfectly straight. The smallest pyramid, Menkaur's, is nudged a bit inward, just off the line formed by the two larger ones. It's like the architect started to draw a straight row and then deliberately shifted one building sideways. For centuries, that offset bothered people. Why break symmetry? Why ruin a perfect row with a tiny intentional mistake? In the early 1980s, an engineer named Robert Bauval happened to be staring at a different set of 3 points. Orion's belt. You know the one. 3 bright stars in a diagonal. He noticed something. 2 of the stars line up almost perfectly. The third is slightly off to the side. Sound familiar? He realized the offset pattern in the sky matched the offset pattern on the ground. So he did what any modern nerd would do. He pulled maps and star charts and started overlaying. When you place the 3 pyramids over the 3 stars of Orion's belt, matching scale and orientation, the alignment is shockingly tight. The Great Pyramid lines up with Alnitak, the brightest star. Khafre's pyramid matches Alnilam, the central star. Menkaur corresponds to Mintaka, the faintest and offset star. Not just roughly. The offset is in the same direction. The 2 brightest pyramids mirror the 2 brightest stars. The smaller, shifted pyramid mirrors the smaller, shifted star. On top of that, when you look west of Giza, the Nile snakes northward like a gleaming river under the night sky. Above it, arching across the heavens, is the Milky Way, a pale band of countless stars. So now imagine this. 3 bright stars on one side of the celestial river. 3 pyramids on one side of the Nile. The 2 patterns, sky and ground, mirroring each other. Suddenly, Giza isn't just a random cluster of big tombs. It starts to look like a map. The land is built to reflect the sky, Earth mimicking the heavens. This idea fits perfectly with the Egyptian mindset. Their texts and temples are full of sayings like, as above, so below, and stories where gods are literally constellations. For them, the night sky wasn't background. It was a realm. Orion, they called it Sa, was linked to Osiris, god of resurrection and the afterlife. The Milky Way was seen as a celestial Nile. If you're designing the ultimate forever monument, what better way than to lock it into that cosmic system? But here's the kicker. The sky is not fixed. Earth wobbles, very slowly. Over about 26,000 years, our planet's axis traces a big circle in space. This wobble is called precession. Think of a spinning top that slowly leans one way, then another. That's Earth. Because of that wobble, the background stars at sunrise and sunset change over long time scales. Constellations rise at different spots on the horizon, depending on where you are in the precessional cycle. So Bauval and others asked, if the pyramids mirror Orion, when does the sky match them best? Using astronomical programs that can rewind and fast forward the heavens, they modeled the position of Orion over Giza at different dates. At 2500 BCE, the conventional pyramid date, the correlation is decent, but not perfect. The angle of Orion's belt doesn't quite match the angle of the pyramids. To get an exact match, you have to rewind much further, to around 10,500 BCE, roughly 12,500 years ago. At that moment in the cycle, Orion's belt sits low on the southern horizon, at exactly the angle mirrored by the pyramids. The Nile/Milky Way pairing lines up beautifully. And something else very important happens on the other side of the sky. That something else involves the Sphinx. The Sphinx faces due east. Twice a year, at the equinoxes, the sun rises exactly in front of its gaze, when day and night are balanced. Now remember precession. At different eras, different constellations rise behind the sun at dawn during the spring equinox. Today it's Pisces. A couple thousand years ago it was Aries. At the time of the pharaohs, around 2500 BCE, Taurus dominated that part of the sky. But in 10,500 BCE, at dawn on the spring equinox over Giza, a very specific constellation rises on the eastern horizon. Leo, the lion. So you've got a lion body guardian on the ground, staring east. A lion-shaped constellation rising exactly where it looks, at exactly that epoch. Lion below, lion above. That is not a vague alignment. That is a bullseye. And it only happens once every 26,000-year precessional cycle, which means the monuments don't just align with Orion. The whole Giza complex seems designed to freeze one particular sky configuration in stone. Orion's belt at a specific low angle in the south. Leo rising in the east at the equinox, right where the Sphinx looks. The Milky Way matching the Nile. That moment is centered around 10,500 BC, the tail end of the Younger Dryas, right when the last ice age is finally loosening its grip and the green Sahara is either emerging or fading, depending which phase you're looking at. Ask yourself, why would a pyramid supposedly built in 2500 BCE be perfectly tuned to a sky pattern from 8,000 years earlier? You don't accidentally align two massive structures and a whole layout to a random ancient configuration. You do that if you're trying to send a message. Think about what precession gives you: a massive cosmic clock. If you understand the slow wobble and can track star positions over long periods, you can timestamp your work. You can say, this is what the sky looked like when we did this. Not in words, but in geometry. The catch? No written Egyptian texts from the dynastic period explicitly talk about precession, at least not in a way we'd recognize. So either the pharaohs inherited something they themselves didn't fully understand, or the knowledge was kept in extremely restricted priestly circles and lost over time, or the original builders weren't the same culture we call Egyptian at all, but they did clearly know the stars. We see it everywhere. Temples aligned so sunlight hits inner sanctuaries on specific days. Star ceilings and tombs with constellations charted. Calendars based on the heliacal rising of Sirius, predicting the Nile flood. This is not a people standing outside at night going, pretty lights. This is a civilization using the sky as a precision tool. So if Giza encoded a moment around 10,500 BC, that suggests one of two big possibilities. The complex itself, or at least its core plan, comes from that period. The builders in a later age were deliberately commemorating a much older epoch. Either way, it ties back to the same idea. Somebody cared deeply about remembering a particular time. Now, connect that time to what we know from geology and climate science. Around 12,900 years ago, the Younger Dryas kicks in: massive disruption, crashes in temperature, sudden environmental chaos. By around 11,600 to 11,500 BC, it starts easing. By 10,500 BC, the climate is stabilizing into the early Holocene, the age we live in. Sea levels are still lower than today, but rising. Ice sheets are retreating. Coasts are reshaping. The green Sahara cycles are in flux. If you're living through this transition, 10,500 BC is more than just an arbitrary date. It's the dawn after a long nightmare, the moment when the world starts to make sense again. If you were a survivor of that cataclysmic shift, and you had the skill to work stone and track the stars, you might well decide, we're going to mark this. We're going to lock this moment into the land so hard that even if we're wiped out, someone someday can read it. No language required. Just a lion on the ground staring at a lion in the sky. 3 pyramids mirroring 3 stars. A river reflecting a galaxy. It's like a cosmic selfie. Here's how the sky looked when our world rebooted. And they built it so big that no matter what else fell, cities, villages, stories, this would remain. So now we got geology saying, the Sphinx is older than the pharaohs. We've got astronomy saying, Giza's layout makes the most sense 12,000 plus years ago. We've got climate science saying, that's when the last great global catastrophe was happening. And we got myths from all over the planet talking about a time when the sky changed, floods rose, and a previous world died. This isn't just about Egypt anymore. It's about a whole layer of human history we almost lost. In the next part, we're going inside the Great Pyramid. Because if the outside is a star map, the inside might be something even stranger, An instrument? If the Giza Plateau is like a giant message written in stone and stars, then the Great Pyramid is the heart of it. From the outside, it's already absurd. Originally, it wasn't a rough, step stack like we see today. It was covered in polished white casing stones, smooth as glass, reflecting the sun so intensely that ancient writers said it looked like a frozen beam of light cutting into the sky. But it's only when you step inside that you realize this thing doesn't feel like a building. It feels like a device. The moment you enter, the sound of the outside world dies. No wind, no city noise, no echoing tourist chatter once you get past the entrance. Just a thick, physical silence. Not nothing. More like a silence that's holding its breath. You move down a low, narrow passage, angled at about 26 degrees. The walls are made from limestone, cut smooth, assembled so tightly you can barely see the joints. Then, suddenly, the passage turns upward. You're climbing now into the grand gallery. The space is insane. It's long, tall, and steep. The walls aren't vertical. They step inward layer by layer, like an inverted staircase, forming a high, core-bell tunnel. The ceiling feels like it's floating above you. You get the strange sensation that you're standing inside the body of an instrument instead of a hallway, as if someone built a giant stone flute and then carved through the middle of it. At the top of this gallery, the space levels out into a low corridor that leads into the most mysterious room in the whole structure, the King's Chamber. It's not decorated. No hieroglyphs, no carvings, no stars painted on the ceiling, just bare stone. But not the same stone as the outside. The King's Chamber is made entirely of red granite, brought from Aswan, hundreds of miles up the Nile. Each block weighs between 25 and 80 tons. The ceiling alone is made of 9 gigantic slabs, together supporting the crushing mass of the pyramid's upper layers. Engineers will tell you this is brilliant structural work. But granite carries another property that ancient builders might not have understood in modern terms, and yet used perfectly. Granite contains quartz. Quartz is piezoelectric. That means when you compress or vibrate it, it generates a tiny electrical charge. Hit the right frequency, and it oscillates like a tuning fork made of crystal. We use this property today in watches, sensors, and electronics. Quartz keeps time. It stabilizes frequencies. It turns mechanical pressure into electrical behavior. Now imagine an entire room made of that stuff. In the 1990s, an engineer named Christopher Dunn went into the King's Chamber with audio equipment and started testing how sound behaved in there. He found that the chamber has a natural resonant frequency, around 440 hertz. If that number rings a bell, it should. 440 hertz is a tuning note A that modern orchestras use. When the chamber is excited with sound near this frequency, something weird happens. The whole room starts to hum. Not in a cartoon way where the walls shake and dust falls. It's subtle. The sound doesn't just bounce around. It seems to sink into stone and then come back out amplified, as if the chamber itself is singing that one note. People standing inside describe the feeling as hearing the sound with their body, not just their ears, feeling a pressure in the chest, sensing a kind of charged atmosphere. This isn't mysticism. This is physics. Every space has resonances. But the King's Chamber isn't just any space. It's a granite box inside a massive limestone pyramid, with specific dimensions, proportions, and multiple relieving chambers stacked above it. 5 narrow granite layers intended, officially, to reduce weight on the room below. Those upper spaces also resonate. It's like a stacked set of tuning cavities. Decades later, in 2018, a team of physicists modeled how the Great Pyramid behaves when subjected to electromagnetic waves in the radio frequency range. They weren't pyramid fans or YouTube theorists. They were doing abstract physics. And they found something unexpected. When electromagnetic waves of certain wavelengths hit the pyramid, it doesn't just scatter them, it focuses them. Fields become intensified in 3 main areas: the King's Chamber, the so-called Queen's Chamber below, and a region underneath the base of the pyramid. Again, there's no copper wiring, no power lines, no ancient generators lying around. This doesn't prove the pyramid was a power plant. in the sci-fi sense. But it does prove that its shape and internal structure naturally concentrate energy, sound and electromagnetic, into specific spaces. So now you've got a resonant stone mountain aligned to true north, a granite chamber that amplifies sound at a key frequency, quartz bearing blocks that respond to mechanical stress and vibration, and a structure that, mathematically, focuses fields as if by design. If you're looking for a tomb, this is an extremely over-engineered tomb. If you're looking for a tool for experience, suddenly it gets interesting. Cultures all over the world talk about specific places on Earth as sacred sites, not just holy in a religious sense, but energetically different, places where people feel tingling, pressure, or altered states. Animals behave strangely. Compasses twitch. Dreams are vivid and time feels weird. Modern measurements show that underground water, fault lines, and quartz-rich rock can create subtle variations in Earth's electromagnetic field. These variations can influence the human nervous system and brain waves. Now layer that idea onto Giza. Suppose the plateau was already a naturally energetic spot. Suppose the builders could feel that through intuition, ritual, trial, and error, without needing an oscilloscope. What would they do? They'd amplify it. They'd tune it. They'd create chambers where that natural hum is heightened, stabilized, shaped, not to charge batteries, to charge people. The king's chamber contains a single object, a rectangular granite box we call a sarcophagus. No lid, no inscription, no decoration. For a tomb, it violates almost every Egyptian habit. Pharaohs normally wanted their names everywhere. Their accomplishments, their prayers, their spells for the afterlife, all carved in obsessive detail. Here, nothing. What if that's because it wasn't meant for a dead body? Not originally, at least. Imagine lying in that granite box in total darkness, while sound, chanting, drumming, toning, fills the chamber. The room vibrates. Your bones vibrate. The quartz in the walls vibrates. Your brain moves into different wave states under the influence of acoustic and electromagnetic resonance. In modern terms, it'd be like a sensory deprivation tank crossed with a sound bath and a lab experiment. In ancient terms, an initiation, a controlled encounter with the other side, not by leaving your body in death, but by pushing your consciousness into a different mode while still alive. Temples and mystery schools from Egypt to Greece to India talk about rites where initiates die before they die, experience symbolic death and rebirth, encounter gods, and return transformed. We usually treat those as metaphor. But what if some of those rituals used architecture as technology? The pyramid becomes a kind of stone engine for altered states. The narrow, low passages strip away everyday posture and comfort. The climb up the grand gallery builds anticipation and tension. The arrival in the chamber is like entering the heart of the earth. The sound and stillness do the rest. Science can't tell us what anyone felt in their 10,000 years ago. We don't have a manual that says, Step 1, lie in box. Step 2, chant on A. Step 3, meet Osiris at 440 hertz. But we can say this. The structure behaves like a tuned system. It was built from materials and shapes that interact with vibration in highly specific ways. It's not just big. It's precise. Whether the builders understood what they were doing in terms of frequencies and fields, or whether they arrived there through generations of experimentation, the effect is the same. They built something that doesn't just stand there. It responds. Modern Egyptologists want the pyramid to be one thing, a tomb, but the Great Pyramid stubbornly refuses to be that simple. No mummy was ever found inside it. No royal inscriptions decorate its walls. Instead, what it gives us is geometry, resonance, silence, alignment. It feels less like a grave and more like a gateway. The ancient Egyptians called it Ake Khufu, usually translated as horizon of Khufu. Horizon is an interesting word, not resting place, not palace. A horizon is where one world meets another. Earth and sky, darkness and light, the known and the unknown. Combine that with everything we've seen, the star alignments, the resonance, the anomalous age hints, and the Great Pyramid stops being a dead pharaoh's ego project and starts looking like the centerpiece of a very old system. A system designed to align human beings with the cosmos itself. In the next part, we'll pull back from Giza and look around the planet. Because once you recognize the patterns here, megaliths, star alignments, impossible stones, you start seeing them everywhere. And the question becomes, how many other one-off mysteries are actually fragments of the same lost story? Once you see Giza as more than just Egyptian stuff, the world starts to look different. Because suddenly, the pyramids don't feel like a weird, isolated achievement. They feel like one piece of a bigger pattern. And that pattern shows up in stone, all over the planet. Let's start in a place that absolutely should not exist. If our textbook timeline is correct, southern Turkey. On a dusty hilltop near the town of Sanliurfa, there's a site that lay buried for thousands of years. Locals called it Potbelly Hill, Göbekli Tepe. In the mid-1990s, archaeologists started digging. What they uncovered blew a crater in archaeology. Beneath the soil were circles of massive stone pillars, T-shaped monoliths, some over 5 meters tall, weighing up to 20 tons each. They weren't just stuck in the ground. They were carved. Foxes, serpents, vultures, big felines, abstract symbols, all in beautiful, precise relief. Here's why that's crazy. Radiocarbon dating places the earliest layers of Göbekli Tepe between 9,500 and 9,000 BCE. That's thousands of years before the first cities, before pottery, before the wheel, before the official start of civilization. According to the standard story, humans at that time were scattered hunter-gatherers, living in small groups, following herds, with no fixed architecture and no complex social structures. Yet somebody organized the labor, design, carving, and alignment of dozens of 20-ton pillars and arranged them into sophisticated circular temples. This isn't primitive. This is intentional, geometrical, symbolic, a place for ritual, gathering, maybe astronomy. And then, around 8,000 BC, something even stranger happens. They bury it, deliberately. They fill the enclosures with rubble and soil, sealing them like time capsules. No invasion, no obvious destruction. It's like the builders said, "We're done here. Cover it." Why would anyone do that? One possibility. The world was changing again. The climate was still unstable in the wake of the Younger Dryas. Sea levels rising, ecosystems shifting. Maybe the people who built this place were forced to move on, and instead of leaving their most sacred site exposed to erosion, vandalism, or enemies, they entombed it, preserved it. For whom? We'll come back to that. Now jump about 1,500 miles southwest to modern Lebanon. In the Bekaa Valley sits a place the Romans made famous, Baalbek. Today, you can still see the remains of their massive temple complex, dedicated to Jupiter. Towering columns, grand staircases, typical Roman go big or go home energy. But the real story isn't the temples we see. It's what they're built on. Beneath Jupiter's temple, forming part of its foundation platform, are some of the most absurd stones on Earth. 3 enormous blocks known as the trilithon. Each one weighs around 800 tons. To compare, the heaviest stones in the Great Pyramid are about 70 to 80 tons. These Baalbek monsters are 10 times heavier. They're not rough boulders. They're rectangular. Their faces are smooth. The edges are sharp. They're fitted into a wall 6 to 7 meters off the ground. And if that isn't insane enough, just down the hill in the quarry lies an even bigger one. The Stone of the Pregnant Woman, at around 1,000 to 1,200 tons. Modern cranes struggle with loads like that. We're supposed to believe Bronze Age workers cut these monsters, transported them uphill, perfectly set them into a tight-fitting foundation. Using what exactly? Ropes and sledges? The Romans, who were absolute beasts at engineering, didn't move stones that big anywhere else in their empire. So when they arrived at Baalbek, they didn't start from scratch. They built on top of an older foundation that was already there. Who laid those colossal blocks? When? How? The further back you push that answer, the more the pattern starts to look familiar. Ancient megaliths, perfect fits, ridiculous weights. No clear explanation. Now, let's go in the opposite direction. East, off the southern coast of Japan, near the island of Yonaguni. A diver in the 1980s discovers something under the water. Huge steps, sharp angles, terraces, platforms. It looks like a sunken stone city. The Yonaguni Monument sits about 20 to 25 meters below the surface. It's at least 75 meters long, with multiple levels, flat plains, and symmetry that scream constructed. Geologists argue about it. Some say, it's natural rock just eroded. Others say, no way, there are tool marks and straight-cut angles. The most interesting point, though, isn't the exact degree of human modification. It's the water. If these structures were fully man-made, they had to be carved when sea levels were lower. That puts them before about 10,000 BC, back when the coastline was different, and this whole structure would have been above water. Same window, late Ice Age, rising seas. If there was a coastal culture there, a lot of its world would now be underwater, just like a lot of ancient coastlines everywhere. Now jump across the Pacific to the Andes, above the Peruvian city of Cusco. The Inca capital sits Sacsayhuaman. If Giza is precise, Sacsayhuaman is insane. The walls are made of enormous andesite blocks, some over 100 tons, some approaching 200. They're not neat rectangles like Baalbek. Each stone is an irregular polygon, like a giant 3D jigsaw piece. And yet, they fit so tightly that modern visitors still slide razor blades along the joints and can't slip them in. No mortar, no gaps, no sloppiness. Every stone is individual, interlocked, smooth and contoured to its neighbors. To make it even crazier, these walls are built in a zigzag pattern, 3 tiers deep, forming a kind of lightning bolt serpent across the hillside. Engineers have pointed out something fascinating. These walls are earthquake-proof. Peru sits on a major seismic zone. Big quakes are common. Where colonial buildings made from bricks and mortar fell, these older megalithic walls stayed standing. The stones can move slightly and then settle back into place. Anti-seismic architecture, built centuries before anyone draws the first modern engineering diagram. Ask the Inca who built it, and their answer is telling. Not us, the ones before us. They had their own name for them, a prior people, often linked to legends of Viracocha, a civilizing god who arrived after a great flood to teach building, agriculture, and law. So now, across 4 continents, we have Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, advanced stonework and symbolism around 9,500 BC, Baalbek in Lebanon, ultramegalithic foundations no one can explain, Yonaguni in Japan, possibly artificial structure now underwater, matching lower sea levels from 10,000 plus BC, Sacsayhuaman in Peru, high-tech stone fitting and seismic design attributed to an earlier people, different cultures, different languages, different myths, same fingerprints, monstrous stones moved in place with absurd precision, geometry and alignments that imply advanced understanding, local stories that say, we inherited this, not, we built it from scratch, the official model says. Well, people everywhere just randomly invented similar megalithic techniques with similar obsessions for alignment, precision, and stone. Could that happen? Sure, humans are clever. But when the pattern keeps matching, especially around the same time windows and same kind of mythic backstory, you have to at least consider a different possibility. What if this isn't coincidence? What if it's continuity? Imagine this. At the end of the last ice age, as a younger Dryas chaos hits, impacts, fires, floods, climate whiplash, a culture that already possesses advanced knowledge get hammered. Their coastal cities? Gone. Their lowland settlements? Drowned or frozen. Their population? Crushed to a fraction of what it was. The survivors scatter. Some end up in the Nile Valley, in Anatolia and the Levant, along the Andean highlands, on now sunken coastlines in Asia. They don't arrive with truckloads of technology. They arrive with memory, with stories, with techniques embedded in ritual. How to shape and interlock huge stones. How to align structures to solstices, equinoxes, and key stars. how to use geometry as sacred language. They hook up with local populations, intermarry, teach, adapt, hybridize. What comes out of that mix is different in each place. Egyptian, Sumerian, Andean, Japanese. But underneath, there are echoes of the same older worldview. You could call it a lost civilization. Or you could call it a lost phase of civilization. A chapter of human history that got shredded by catastrophe, then partially stitched back together, piece by piece, across the globe. And the clearest thread running through all those pieces? Stone. Big, stubborn, unerasable stone. If you know your world is fragile, if you've seen it collapse once already, the message you send to the future is not written on paper. It's not carved in wood. It's not even stored in metal. Metal rusts. You carve into the bones of the planet itself. You choose granite and limestone. You align your work with the stars, because the stars are the only thing more permanent than stone. You assume that one day someone will dig and measure and wonder. In the next part, we're going to zoom in on the event that nearly wiped that earlier world off the map, because the evidence is no longer just a myth and stone. It's in the ground, in a thin, dark line of debris that circles the planet, the fingerprint of the day the sky fell. If you want to know what killed the world before ours, you don't have to guess. The answer is literally written in the ground, not in pyramids or temples this time, in a thin, dark layer of dirt that shows up all over the planet. Geologists call it a boundary layer. Archaeologists call it a black mat. You and I can call it what it is, a scar. Let's rewind to about 12,900 years ago. The Ice Age is ending. Glaciers are retreating. Temperatures are rising, and the planet is slowly moving toward a warmer, more stable climate. Humans are scattered across the world, hunting, gathering, experimenting with early farming in some places. In North America, giant animals roam. Mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, enormous beavers and camels. It's wild, literally and figuratively. Then, in geological terms, overnight, it ends. Around the early 2000s, researchers started noticing something weird in the sediment layers at certain ancient sites, especially around North America. There was this thin layer of dark material, about a few centimeters thick. That marked a sharp transition. Below it, rich, diverse ecosystems, ancient tools, animal bones from megafauna. Above it, colder conditions, fewer species, different tool types, and in some cases, a break in human occupation. Inside that dark layer, total chaos. In 2007, a team led by Richard Firestone at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab published a bombshell paper. They'd analyzed the Younger Dryas boundary, the layer marking the start of that abrupt cooling event 12,900 years ago, across multiple sites. What they found was like a cosmic crime scene. Inside that narrow band of Earth, they detected nanodiamonds, microscopic diamonds that form under extreme pressure and heat, like what you get in cosmic impacts or nuclear blasts, not campfires. Magnetic spherules, tiny, perfectly rounded droplets of metals like iron and nickel, formed when material is vaporized and then recondenses while falling to the atmosphere. Melt glass, little bits of glassy material created when sand or rock is heated above its melting point, over 1,700 degrees Celsius, and then cooled quickly. Iridium, a rare metal in Earth's crust, but relatively common in asteroids and comets. Fullerenes with extraterrestrial helium, carbon molecules that trap the type of helium isotope associated with space, not Earth, and all of it clustered right at that 12,900-year mark. You don't get that combo from normal volcanoes. You don't get from lightning, wildfires, or slow climate change. It points to one thing. Something from space hit us. And not gently. The impact hypothesis that came out of this is wild. A large comet enters the inner solar system. As it approaches Earth, it breaks apart. Not into cute meteors that make wishes. Into dozens, maybe hundreds, of city-killer-sized fragments. Some of those fragments slam into the massive ice sheets that covered much of North America and Northern Europe at that time. The energy released? Think millions of Hiroshima bombs going off in rapid succession. You get instant vaporization of ice. shock waves ripping through the atmosphere, superheated air that ignites forests thousands of kilometers away, tsunamis triggered by collapsing ice sheets and displaced oceans. The impacts blast vaporized rock and water high into the stratosphere, where it spreads around the globe as dust and aerosols. Sunlight gets blocked. Temperatures crash. That's the start of the Younger Dryas, an abrupt return to near glacial conditions that lasted over 1,000 years. We see it in ice cores from Greenland, oxygen isotopes that indicate temperature drop, dust layers that indicate massive atmospheric disturbance. We see it in lake sediments and peat bogs across Europe, the Middle East, and North America. Sudden changes in pollen, showing forest ecosystems collapsing. Huge increases in charcoal, showing continent-scale wildfires. We see it in the fossil record. Megafauna populations nosedive. Many species completely disappear within a narrow time band. North America gets hit especially hard. Over 35 kinds of large mammals go extinct, along with the Clovis culture, the people we once thought were the earliest known Americans. Their signature stone spear points vanish from the archaeological record right at that boundary. And then there's the water. Ice sheets the size of small continents melt and destabilize. The oceans rise in pulses. Geologists call them meltwater pulses, and they show up in sea level reconstructions like giant stair steps. One in particular, around 11,600 years ago, is brutal, a sudden rise that may have added several meters of water in a relatively short time. Any advanced coastal culture? Gone. Settlements wiped out. Harbors drowned. Rivers choked with debris. The survivors would have been forced to retreat inland or up in altitude, to refuges like the Nile Valley, the highlands of Anatolia, the edges of mountain ranges, places like the future home of Göbekli Tepe. This is when the myths kick in, because people don't live through something like that and just move on. They tell stories, over and over, until the story becomes sacred. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh tells of Utnapishtim, the man who survives a flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity. The description is not a gentle rain. The storm roared like a bull. The land shattered like a pot. People could no longer see one another. The gods themselves were terrified by the deluge. It speaks of fire and darkness and walls of water. In the biblical tradition, Noah's flood echoes the same themes. The fountains of the deep break open. The windows of heaven are unleashed. Rain falls for 40 days and 40 nights, but the waters stay on the earth far longer. In ancient Egypt, you get Sekhmet, the lioness goddess sent out as the Eye of Ra to punish humanity. She becomes an unstoppable force of destruction, almost wiping out mankind in a frenzy of blood, until the other gods trick her with beer dyed red to look like blood. Fire from heaven, mass death, partial mercy. In North America, the Hopi talk about previous worlds destroyed by fire and ice and flood. They say we're living in the fourth world, the previous three having been wiped away for corruption and imbalance. The Cree tell the time when the sky fell, bringing a storm of burning ice. Many indigenous groups across the Americas have stories of the world being remade after a destruction from above. In Australia, Aboriginal traditions speak of the sky people throwing fire that reshaped the land and killed multitudes, a story once dismissed as myth until researchers began linking Aboriginal oral history to real impact craters. In India, texts talk about Pralaya, a cyclical dissolution of the world by fire and water, followed by recreation and a new age. Again and again, you get the same pattern. Fire from above, darkness, cold, flood, survivors chosen or warned, a rebuilt world. Archaeologists, for a long time, said, these are just flood myths. Cultures like to exaggerate local disasters. But then the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis starts lining up with the timing of these stories. And suddenly, the idea that people were remembering a real, global-scale catastrophe doesn't seem so far-fetched. Think about how we talk about it today. If tomorrow a comet broke apart in fragments slammed into Greenland and Antarctica, we'd have instant global media, satellite photos, live streams, censored data. But let's say our tech fails. Grids go down. Cities burn. Billions die. A few scattered survivors cling on in remote regions. They're traumatized. Their kids grow up in a world where the most important story they inherit isn't who was president or what apps we used. It's the sky fell, the world burned, the waters rose. We survived because someone warned us. Don't forget. Now extend that forward 500 years. Nobody remembers iPhones. Nobody remembers cars. But everyone remembers the story of the day the sky betrayed them. Now stretch it to 3,000 years. 5,000. The details get fuzzy. The physics is gone. The gods enter the picture. But the core survives. Fire, flood, judgment, survival, renewal. We're used to thinking of myth as fiction and science as fact. But in deep time, myth is often just memory wrapped in metaphor. And science is us finally catching up to what those metaphors were trying to say. So here's the rough sequence we're looking at. A large comet breaks up and slams into Earth around 12,900 years ago. Immediate consequences. Firestorms, shock waves, atmospheric dust, abrupt cooling. Longer-term consequences. Melted ice sheets, flood pulses, drowned coastlines, megafauna extinctions, human population bottlenecks. Survivors scatter to refuges, carrying both trauma and knowledge. Over centuries, their descendants rebuild, sometimes with echoes of the old world embedded in their architecture, myths, and rituals. In that context, places like Giza, Göbekli Tepe, Baalbek, Sacsayhuaman, and possibly Yonaguni stop looking like random, ancient mysteries and start looking like survival nodes, refuges, reboot points, centers where people gathered after the storm to remember, reframe, and rebuild. And in those places, they didn't just build shelters, they built messages. Giza may be one of the clearest. A lion monument eroded by a climate older than the pharaohs. Pyramids aligned to a sky pattern centered on 10,500 BC, right in the shadow of the catastrophe. A resonant structure tuned to Earth's energy. Myths of Zep Tepi, the first time when order was reestablished after chaos. All of it makes a lot more sense if you imagine the builders as survivors of the younger Dryas trying to lock their story into the landscape, not in books. Those burn, not in cities. Those collapse, in stone, in stars. Ice Age, comet impact, flooded coastlines. We lived through it. Here's our monument. Decode it. So, if that's what they were doing, what exactly were they trying to tell us? What did they know about cycles, about the sky, about catastrophe that we've half forgotten? In the next part, we're going back to Egypt, into its myths. Because the Egyptians didn't just preserve this story in stone. They preserved it in their idea of time itself. They even gave the lost age a name. Zep Tepi, the first time. So we've looked at the rocks. We've looked at the sky. Now, let's ask a different question. What did the Egyptians themselves say about their own origins? Because here's the twist nobody talks about. They never said, "We are the first. We invented civilization." They said the opposite. Over and over, in temple walls, tomb texts, and ritual inscriptions, you see a theme. We are restoring something, bringing it back, copying an earlier pattern. They even had a name for that earlier age. They called it Zep Tepi, the first time. You find this phrase embedded all through their religious language. In hymns, rituals, and coronation texts, pharaohs brag less about, "I built this," and more about, "I did this as it was done in Zep Tepi." Zep Tepi was their golden age, the era when the gods themselves walked the earth, when order was first established, when the world shifted from chaos into cosmos. We tend to file that under myth, the same way we treat Zeus or Odin. But what if Zep Tepi isn't just an abstract, spiritual before time? What if it's cultural memory of the age right after the cataclysm? Let's look at how the Egyptians described the beginning of the world. In one of their oldest creation stories, especially in the theology of Heliopolis, it starts with Nun. Nun isn't a god with a human body. Nun is the primordial ocean. Everything is water. No land, no sky, no living beings. Just infinite, dark, restless sea. Then, from that ocean, something happens. A mound rises. A little island of dry land emerges from a flood. They call it the Benben. The first hill, the primeval mound. On that first mound stands Adam, the self-created God. From Adam comes the rest of the structure. Shu, air. Tefnut, moisture. Geb, earth. Nut, sky. And eventually all the other gods. In modern religious studies, this is cosmogony, a story of how the universe began. But if you strip away the divine names and look at the imagery, it's incredibly literal. Water everywhere, then emerging land, then the return of air, sky, stability. Now, add what we know from geology. At the end of the Younger Dryas and into the early Holocene, sea levels were rising dramatically. Glaciers were melting. Coastlines were shifting. Lowlands were flooding, then stabilizing. To people living through that, the world would absolutely feel like it had been nothing but water. And then, over time, new land appeared or reappeared. The Nile's annual flood reenacts this on a small scale every year. Water rises, covers the fields. Everything turns to mud. Then the water retreats. The land emerges, dark and fertile, ready for crops. Egyptians watch this cycle every single year. So you end up with a worldview where creation isn't an abstract cosmic event 13.8 billion years ago. Creation is a pattern. Water, then land, then order. And Zep Tepi is the first time that pattern played out, not metaphorically, but historically. The first time after the big flood. The Egyptians even made this visible. At Heliopolis, they venerated a sacred stone, the Benben stone. We don't have any more, but ancient texts describe it as a conical or pyramidal stone kept in Ra's temple. It symbolized that first mound, the very first dry land that rose out of none. Now ask yourself, what else in Egypt looks like a Benben? Every pyramid. Every pyramid once had a pyramidion at its top, a miniature Benben, often coated in gold or electrum, meant to catch the very first light of sunrise. The Great Pyramid's original capstone is gone, but the idea is baked into its design. One massive artificial primeval hill, topped by a shining Benben. Think about what that says. The pyramid is not just a tomb. It's a symbol of land rising from flood, light touching that land first, order emerging from chaos. In other words, a stone reenactment of Zep Tepi. Now zoom out. Put this next to the Younger Dryas story. Floods and chaos, then gradual stabilization. Survivors gathering along refuges like the Nile. If your ancestors lived through that, the first patches of dry, fertile ground are literally sacred. They're the difference between extinction and survival. You will remember that. You'll tell your kids, once, everything was water. Then this land rose. Here, this place. From this spot, we began again. Over centuries, as the details blur, that becomes, in the beginning, there was only none. Then the Benben rose, and the gods began the world. Myth, yes, but myth wrapped around a real experience. Now, let's talk about how the pharaohs saw themselves in relation to that first time. They didn't say, I'm the first. They said, I'm copying the first. They used phrases like, I restore what was in ruins. I bring the temple back to the state of Zep Tepi. I renew what was created in the first time. Their job wasn't to invent. It was to maintain, to keep reality aligned with the original pattern laid down when order was first established. Every major ritual in Egypt is a replay of Zep Tepi, the morning opening of the shrine doors, the coronation of a pharaoh, the said festival that rejuvenates the king after 30 years. Even the daily offerings of food, beer, and incense, they're all described as doing what was done in the first time. It's like a cosmic reset button being pressed over and over. Remember how we survived. Remember how order was created. Do that again. Now here's where it gets really interesting. We have an artifact called the Inventory Stela, a limestone tablet found at Giza in the 19th century. It's written in later hieroglyphs, but claims to record events in the time of Khufu, the pharaoh who supposedly built the Great Pyramid. What you'd expect it to say is, Khufu built the pyramid. Khufu carved the Sphinx. Khufu invented everything. Please clap. It doesn't. Instead, it describes Khufu visiting Giza and finding the house of Isis, mistress of the pyramid, the house of the Sphinx. already there, already ancient, already in need of restoration. It basically says, Khufu found these monuments. He cleared them, honored them, and built new temples beside them. Mainstream Egyptology brushes this off as pious fiction, saying the stele is late and the story is propaganda. But even if it is later, the mindset is revealing. By the time this inscription was carved, the Egyptians themselves believed the Sphinx was older than Khufu. The pyramid complex had pre-existing sacred structures. Their own greatest monuments were tied to something deeper and older. Add in the dream stele of Thutmose IV, standing between the Sphinx's paws, and you get the same vibe. Thutmose doesn't brag about building the Sphinx. He says he found it buried in sand. He cleared it, honored it, restored it. Even over 1,000 years after Khufu, the Sphinx was already being treated as an ancient relic, not a recent sculpture. If Khufu and Thutmose are restorers, not originators, it fits perfectly into the bigger pattern. Dynastic Egypt inheriting and refreshing monuments and ideas from Zep Tepi from the first time, from an older world. Look at it this way. To us, the pyramids are the beginning. To the Egyptians, they were the middle. Behind them, in their own memory, was an even earlier age, when gods and semi-divine beings ruled, when knowledge was complete, when the pattern of order was first laid down. We've thrown that away as mythology, but tie it to the Sphinx's water erosion that points to a wetter, pre-dynastic climate, the star alignments that point back to 10,500 BCE, the global impact evidence of the Younger Dryas, the flood stories from cultures worldwide, and Zep Tepi stops being just a poetic phrase and starts looking like the Egyptian name for the reboot after the cataclysm. The first time after the last time almost ended everything. The Egyptians then built a culture that was basically one long ritual of not forgetting how fragile order is, not forgetting that the waters can rise again, not forgetting that the sky can betray you. So they encoded their lessons in stone, the pyramids, the temples, the Sphinx, story, myths of Nun, Benben, Adam, Are, and the gods, practice, daily rituals designed to keep Ma'at, the divine balance. Ma'at isn't just justice. It's the idea that reality itself has a right order, and if you let chaos isfit win, things fall apart. Think of that in light of a civilization that may have inherited trauma from an age of fire and flood. Of course, your number one value is don't let chaos win again. And your biggest monuments? They're not flexes. They're reminders. We tend to see the pyramids as obsessive death machines for kings. The Egyptians may have seen them as anchors to the first time, scaled-up Benben stones, tying the land to its creation pattern, cosmic hard drives preserving a memory of when the world almost didn't make it. And tucked inside those myths and stones is a message that sounds surprisingly modern. We've been wiped back to the edge before. We rebuilt. You can too. In the next part, we'll bring all of this together. Because if Giza is a message from survivors, what exactly are they warning us about? And what happens if the cycle they encoded in stone isn't over? If the Egyptians were right about anything, it's this: time doesn't just run in a straight line. It loops, it turns, it cycles. They didn't picture history as a staircase climbing endlessly upward. They saw it as a wheel that's already rolled over us once, maybe more than once. In their worldview, Zep Tepi the first time wasn't some unreachable fantasy. It was a reference point, a pattern, an original alignment between heaven and earth that you could drift away from or return to. That's why everything was about renewal. Every dawn was a mini creation event. Every coronation was a replay of the first king being crowned. Every major festival was a ritualized reboot of the cosmos. They weren't doing that because they liked ceremonies. They were doing it because, in their memory, the world had already failed before. When you live in a culture built on that kind of memory, you don't assume the world just keeps getting better forever. You assume that if you fall too far out of alignment, with nature, with the sky, with Ma'at, with reality itself, chaos doesn't politely knock. It kicks the door in. Now layer that mindset over what we've seen from geology. The Younger Dryas comet event, not the first time Earth has been smacked from space. The dinosaur killer 66 million years ago was bigger. Before that, there were others. Crater after crater. Extinction after extinction. Earth is a pattern. Long periods of relative calm, punctuated by sudden, catastrophic resets. It looks smooth on a chart. It doesn't feel smooth when you're living through it. Even within the last 100,000 years, it's not like humans coasted in a gentle climate. We've been through ice ages, sudden warm spikes, droughts that lasted centuries, sea level jumps that redrew the map. We call the Younger Dryas a catastrophe. To Earth, it was Tuesday. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable. The thing that nailed us 12,900 years ago isn't gone. If the impact hypothesis is right, the culprit was likely a large comet that fragmented and got trapped in a debris stream, something like the torrid meteor stream we passed through today. We still fly through that cloud twice a year. Most of the time, we just get pretty meteors. But embedded within that stream, astronomers have identified much larger objects, dark, hard-to-detect bodies that cross Earth's orbit. Most of the time, everything misses. Sometimes it doesn't. That's not fear-mongering. That's orbital mechanics. We now have telescopes, radar, and space agency scanning for near-Earth objects. We track thousands. We simulate thousands more. We're better prepared than any previous civilization, but not invincible. Even a relatively small impact in the wrong place, a major ocean, an ice sheet, a populated region, would change everything. The Egyptians didn't know orbital periods or impact probabilities, but they did know this. The sky is not harmless. The world is not guaranteed. Order is temporary. When they talk about gods punishing humanity or floods sent to cleanse a corrupt world, they're wrapping a harsh lesson in sacred language. This isn't stable. Don't act like it is. When you put that together with the stone evidence, the alignments, the geometry, the encoding of specific dates in the heavens, what Giza starts to look like is not just a memory of what happened, but a warning about what can happen. And that warning has layers. On the surface, you've got the flood stories. Once, we were nearly wiped out. Don't forget. A little deeper, you've got the stellar timestamp. We built this to point at when it happened. Deeper still, you've got the resonance and proportion. We understood the structure of reality well enough to encode it in stone, learn to read it. And underneath all of it, you have a philosophical punch in the gut. Civilization is fragile. The things you think will last forever won't. So build for more than profit. Build for more than one lifetime. Build for deep time. Our world right now is loud. Skyscrapers, satellites, megacities, servers humming 24/7. We carry supercomputers in our pockets and stream cat videos from space. It's easy to feel like we're unshakable. But step back, and we're not that different from them. We live on coasts. We cluster along rivers. We depend on stable climate patterns, predictable seasons, and supply chains stretched like spiderwebs across the planet. If a disruption big enough hits, natural or self-inflicted, it doesn't just knock out a city. It hits everything, all at once. The people who built Giza knew what it was like to watch a world unravel. The difference is they didn't have telescopes, satellites, or simulations. They had memory and stone. So they did the thing a traumatized but brilliant culture would do. They locked their story into the hardest medium they had. We treat the pyramids like museums. They might be more like messages in a bottle. Imagine someone 10,000 years from now walking through the ruins of our world. Our skyscrapers will be gone. Steel rusts. Glass shatters. Concrete erodes. Our cloud servers? Dust. Our data? Corrupted. What's left? Maybe a few mountains of plastic in the wrong place. A weird layer of chemicals in the rock. And if we're lucky, if we think like the people of Giza, a few deliberately designed structures that say, we were here. This is what mattered. This is what we learned. Right now, we don't really build like that. We build for efficiency, speed, short-term gain. The Great Pyramid was not designed on quarterly returns. It was designed on millennia. It doesn't have to be mystical to matter. It just has to remind us of a thing we'd rather not think about. We're temporary. The world changes fast. And if we want our story to outlast the next shock, whatever it is, we have to plan like the builders at Giza Planner, with humility, with seriousness, with an eye on deep time. Not just, how do we survive, but how do we help the future remember? The former world survivors left us. Flood myths, star maps in stone, massive megaliths aligned to cosmic cycles. We, if we're paying attention, get a choice. We can shrug and say, cool story, bro, but pyramids are tombs, myths are fairy tales, and nothing like that will ever happen again. Or we can do what they hope someone would do. We can read the message. We can admit, civilization has crashed before. It can crash again. Our job isn't to panic, but to prepare and to preserve. That doesn't mean building new pyramids. It means thinking beyond 100 years. It means making sure our most important knowledge isn't stored only in fragile formats that die when the power goes out. It means remembering that nature, space, and time aren't impressed by us. The people at Giza didn't just fear the sky. They revered it. They aligned to it. They used it as their clock and their memory bank. We mostly ignore it, like polluted cities where you can barely see a dozen stars. They built architecture you can't properly understand without looking up. We built architecture you can't properly understand without looking down into screens. Maybe that's the real warning. Not just beware catastrophe, but don't forget to look up. Don't forget your place in the bigger system. Don't confuse technology with invincibility. Because the last time humanity made that mistake, we almost didn't get another chance. In the next part, we're going back to Giza one last time. Night sky overhead. The Sphinx staring east. The pyramids dark against the horizon. And we'll ask, if this really is a message from a prior cycle, what are we going to do with it? Picture this. It's just before dawn on the Giza Plateau. The tour buses are gone. The vendors have packed up. The floodlights that turn the pyramids into a postcard backdrop have been switched off. For the first time all day, it's quiet. No engines. No shouting. Just wind over stone. You're standing there on the desert floor, the silhouettes of the three pyramids in front of you, the dark bulk of the Sphinx off to your right, crouched low like it's waiting. Overhead, the sky is full. No city glare. No neon. Just stars. And as your eyes adjust, you start to see what the ancient builders saw. Low in the southern sky, a familiar pattern appears. 3 stars in a diagonal line. Orion's belt. You trace it with your gaze. Then turn back to ground. Behind you, stretching across the plateau, are the 3 pyramids, not in a straight line. Offset, just like the stars. And suddenly it clicks. You're standing inside a star map. The Nile behind you mirrors the Milky Way above. The pyramids mirror Orion's belt. The Sphinx faces exactly east, waiting for the first light. None of this is random. You're not in a pile of old rocks. You're standing in a message. Think about the level of obsession it takes to build something like this. Most of us struggle to plan 5 years ahead. These people are encoding epics. They're locking a specific sky into stone. The sky of around 10,500 BC. The age of Leo rising in the east at equinox. Orion low in the south, in perfect alignment with the pyramids. A cosmic timestamp. Why? Not to say we are awesome, but to say, this is when it happened. This is when the last cycle turned. This is when the old world died and the new one began. This is when the first time Zep Tepi unfolded, when land rose from flood and order shivered back into place. Now imagine being one of the people who lived closer to that moment. You grew up hearing the stories. Your great-great-grandmother saw the sky burn. Your ancestors walked across lands that are now sea. There were cities once, down where the water is now. You walked through a landscape still scarred, massive boulders dropped by glaciers, shorelines freshly carved, strange relics poking out of silt. You know, in your bones, the world is not consistently kind. Do you build flimsy, short-term, or do you do the opposite? Do you build something that refuses to die? A structure that can outlast floods, invaders, desertification, empire, even amnesia? That's what the Great Pyramid is. We call it a tomb. But if you were designing a tomb, you wouldn't need multi-layered geometry, encoding pi and phi, stellar shafts aligned to Orion and the circumpolar stars, a mass that weighs about 6 million tons, tuned to resonate at specific frequencies. You'd need a room, a passageway, some guards. The pyramid is something else. It's a carrier wave, a broadcast, an architectural hello to the deep future. We talk about sending golden records into space with messages for aliens. They built the stone equivalent and aimed it not at other planets, but at us. Here's the wild thing. We almost missed it. For most of modern history, we walked around Giza with the wrong story in our heads. We thought, primitive people, big ego, big tomb. We were blind to the alignments, blind to the erosion, blind to the math, because we didn't ask the question the monuments demand. What are you trying to tell me? We asked, who's buried inside? Spoiler, no one we can prove. The only sarcophagus in the king's chamber has never been shown to hold a mummy. No hieroglyphs line the walls. No funerary scenes. No, here lies the great so-and-so. Just stone, precision, silence. Silence doesn't mean absence. Sometimes silence means listen harder. Now layer on everything we've walked through in this series. A global climatic catastrophe around 12,900 years ago. Evidence that Egypt's landscape was wetter, greener, stormier thousands of years before the pharaohs. The Sphinx's enclosure carved by rainfall Egypt no longer gets. Giza's layout aligning not to pharaoh's sky, but to a much older epic. Egyptian myths that sound suspiciously like survival stories from a flood and fire world. Other megalithic sites across the globe that don't fit neatly into the slow, linear development narrative. At some point, the simplest explanation stops being coincidence and starts being. We're looking at the ruins of a civilization that remembered, not remembered in the way we do, with hard drives and cloud storage. Remembered in myth, in ritual, in stone. The people who rebuilt after the Younger Dryas didn't have the luxury of thinking. Catastrophes only happen in movies. They knew they'd lost friends, families, whole cultures to impacts, floods, fires, and ice. So they built a culture that never stops reenacting the saving of the world. Daily reenactments of creation in temples. Annual festivals to renew the king and the land. Monumental architecture to anchor the memory in rock. From their point of view, this isn't superstition. It's maintenance. Reality isn't stable. You have to keep it aligned. Ma'at, the principle of balance, truth, and rightness, isn't just morality. It's system integrity. If you break Ma'at hard enough and long enough, the universe responds. Maybe that looks like social collapse. Maybe it looks like famine. Maybe once in a while, it looks like the sky throwing rocks. So what is Giza really? It's a reminder that we're not the first to reach high levels of organization and knowledge. Reset events are real. Memory can survive if you choose the right media. And the universe does not care about your smugness. That last one stings a bit. We're very proud of ourselves. We have satellites and fusion experiments and space telescopes that literally look back in time. But we also have fragile grids, overstretched ecosystems, nuclear stockpiles, an atmosphere we're casually tweaking. We're more advanced than the builders of Giza in some ways, but we're also more vulnerable because we're more interconnected. Pull one thread hard enough, the whole thing comes apart. The people behind Giza seem to be saying, we've seen complex systems crash. We built something to speak to whoever comes after the next crash. We might be those people, or there might be others after us. Either way, the message stands. Remember, the sky is not just beautiful. It's dangerous. Remember, the planet is not just a backdrop. It's a living system with limits. Remember, knowledge can vanish faster than you think. Remember, you're not invincible, but you are capable of preparing. Standing there at Giza in the pre-dawn, watching the eastern horizon brighten, you can feel two timelines at once. One is small, your life, your generation, the news cycle, the trends. The other is huge, Ice ages, comet fragments, civilizations rising, falling, and rising again. Both are real. We tend to live entirely in the small one. The builders of Giza lived with the big one burned into their psychology. They knew what it meant to lose almost everything. We know it too, in a way. Every time we watch a disaster live stream from across the world, some part of our brain whispers, this could scale. But we drown that voice out with noise. They carved their awareness into stone, so it couldn't be drowned. So what do we do with that? Do we shrug and go, cool, ancient people were deep? Or do we let it change how we see ourselves? Because once you accept that civilization is not a one-time miracle, but a repeating process, rise, fall, reboot, everything shifts. Progress stops being guaranteed. It becomes a responsibility. We are not the most advanced humans ever, and that's the end of the story. We're the current iteration. That's a humbling thought, but it's also empowering because it means we're part of a chain. There were people before us who faced a void and said, we'll leave something behind. We can do the same. Not necessarily with stone. That weighs millions of tons. But with choices, with what we prioritize, with what we decide is worth preserving for people who will never know our names. In the next part, we'll step away from the plateau just a little and talk about what this story means for us right now. Not as archaeologists, not as conspiracy theorists. As humans standing at the edge of our own unknowns, holding a message from survivors who lived through theirs. Let's step back from the sand for a moment. Forget dates. Forget dynasties. Forget comet fragments and nanodiamonds and precessional angles. Just ask this. Why does this story hit so hard? Why does the idea that we've been here before feel both terrifying and strangely comforting? Because if the pyramids really are a message from survivors, then we're not looking at a spooky anomaly. We're looking at a mirror. Right now, we live in a world that is loud about progress and quiet about fragility. We talk about innovation, disruption, and exponential growth. We don't like to talk about limits, collapse, and the fact that every civilization before us eventually hit a wall. Even the Egyptians, the masters of forever, did. Their dynasties broke. Their language died. Their temples crumbled. Their gods were forgotten. For over 1,000 years, nobody could even read their writing. Think about that. A culture obsessed with continuity lost its voice. If the Rosetta Stone hadn't turned up, the entire story of ancient Egypt would still be locked in carved symbols we'd admire and never understand. Now imagine how many civilizations didn't get a Rosetta Stone at all. How many cultures built in wood, clay, and story, and left almost nothing behind. We only notice the ones that built in stone. Giza is shouting from deep time because it chose the one medium loud enough to reach across millennia. So here's the uncomfortable question for us. What are we choosing? What parts of our world are actually built to last? Not for decades, not for centuries, for thousands of years. Most of what feels important right now, social feeds, news cycles, digital libraries, cloud servers, would vanish in a long power outage or a few centuries of neglect. Silicon chips don't fossilize. Fiber optic cables don't become sacred relics. Even our skyscrapers aren't built like pyramids. They're meant to be impressive now, not indestructible later. That doesn't mean we should start hauling 70-ton stones up hills. But it does mean we might want to borrow a mindset from the people who did. Think in deep time. The builders at Giza weren't just working for a paycheck. They were working for a timeline where they personally didn't matter, but the message did. We rarely do that. Our systems reward short-term wins. Elections, quarters, trends. Deep time doesn't care about any of that. The people behind Giza accepted a harsh truth. We won't be here when this is really understood. Build it anyway. There's a kind of faith in that. Not religious faith necessarily, but faith in a future audience. Faith that someone, someday, will stand where you're standing, look up at the same stars, and want to know. They built for that person. For you. For anyone who'd show up thousands of years later and say, what were you trying to tell me? So ask yourself, if someone walked through the ruins of our world 10,000 years from now, what would they learn? Would they see An intelligent species that cooperated to protect its world, or a clever species that burned through everything and left a thin layer of plastic and radiation in the rocks? Would they see monuments to fear and power, or monuments to knowledge and connection? Would they see anything at all? From the perspective of the Giza builders, we are that future. We are the distant inheritors. We are the ones who finally got telescopes, satellites, quantum physics, and climate science. We're the ones who can look at their message and, for the first time, test it. We can confirm that climate does flip fast, confirm that impacts do happen, confirm that sea levels do jump, confirm that the Sahara was once green. We can look at global data and say, yeah, they weren't wrong to be worried. We're also the first humans with the ability to see incoming threats in space before they happen. We can track near-Earth objects. We can model orbits. We can think about deflection, evacuation, mitigation. No previous cycle on this planet had that chance. So the question isn't just, did an advanced civilization exist before the pharaohs? The deeper question is, if they could speak to us now, what would they want us to do with what they left? Would they want us to argue endlessly about whether Khufu or somebody older laid the first stone? Or would they want us to say, okay, point taken. This system is fragile. Let's not sleepwalk through it. When you look at Giza's survival message, 3 themes jump out. 1, respect the sky. Not in a horoscope way, in a physics way. They encoded star positions because the sky is both a clock and a threat. We are finally in a position to do something about that threat. We can support surveys that map near-Earth objects. We can prioritize planetary defense as seriously as we prioritize, say, streaming services or weapon systems. If our ancestors nearly died from falling ice and rock, the least we can do is keep an eye out. 2, respect the planet. The Egyptians wrapped this in the language of Ma'at: balance, truth, rightness. We wrap it in words like sustainability, climate stability, and carrying capacity. Same idea. You push a system too hard, it pushes back. The Younger Dryas' impact might have been cosmic, but the flood that followed, the climate chaos, the extinctions, those were amplified by a stressed, already changing world. Today, we're the stress. We're nudging climate, biodiversity, and oceans out of their normal bounds. We don't need a comet to have a bad time. We can crash this on our own. Giza whispers, it doesn't take much to tip the balance. Don't assume you're immune. 3, respect memory. The pyramids aren't about kings. They're about memory. Memory of a green Sahara that no longer exists, a sky layout that no longer exists, a world that almost no longer existed. We don't have to copy their architecture, but we can copy their insistence on not letting hard-won lessons vanish. That means keeping critical knowledge in multiple formats, including low-tech, durable ones. Teaching long-term thinking, not just what's on the test. Preserving not only data, but context. So future generations don't just inherit facts, but meaning. Imagine if, before the Younger Dryas, there had been a global culture with observatories, mathematics, stone records. We'd be sitting here today, not guessing at what happened, but reading their equivalent of a how-to manual. What they tried, what worked, what failed. Instead, we got fragments. We got myths. We got stone puzzles like Giza. It's better than nothing, but we're capable of more. And that's where this story stops being just a cool theory about the past and starts becoming a challenge to the present. We're standing at a threshold they might recognize. Not because a comet is definitely inbound, though we know objects are out there, but because our entire system is strained. Population, energy, climate, tech, geopolitics, all tightly coupled, all capable of surprising us. We don't get to choose whether we're in a story about risk. We are, but we do get to choose what kind of characters we are. We can be the ones who ignore the signs, laugh at long-term warnings, and assume the party never ends. Or we could be the ones who say, somebody built a stone library 12,000 years ago, and we're the first people with the tools to really read it. Let's not waste that. When you understand Giza as a potential message from a previous cycle, it doesn't make the world scarier. It makes it sharper. It turns the pyramids from tourist backdrops into something more like a conversation. A conversation across time between people who lived through a near extinction and people who are powerful enough to prevent or soften the next one. Us. In the final part, we'll go back one more time to that pre-dawn moment on the plateau, because there's one more piece to the story. Not just what they did, but what we do next. Let's step back from the sand for a moment. Forget dates. Forget dynasties. Forget comet fragments and nanodiamonds and precessional angles. Just ask this. Why does this story hit so hard? Why does the idea that we've been here before feel both terrifying and strangely comforting? Because if the pyramids really are a message from survivors, then we're not looking at a spooky anomaly. We're looking at a mirror. Right now, we live in a world that is loud about progress and quiet about fragility. We talk about innovation, disruption, and exponential growth. We don't like to talk about limits, collapse, and the fact that every civilization before us eventually hit a wall. Even the Egyptians, the masters of forever, did. Their dynasties broke. Their language died. Their temples crumbled. Their gods were forgotten. For over 1,000 years, nobody could even read their writing. Think about that. A culture obsessed with continuity lost its voice. If the Rosetta Stone hadn't turned up, the entire story of ancient Egypt would still be locked in carved symbols we'd admire and never understand. Now imagine how many civilizations didn't get a Rosetta Stone at all. How many cultures built in wood, clay, and story, and left almost nothing behind. We only notice the ones that built in stone. Giza is shouting from deep time because it chose the one medium loud enough to reach across millennia. So here's the uncomfortable question for us. What are we choosing? What parts of our world are actually built to last? Not for decades, not for centuries, for thousands of years. Most of what feels important right now, social feeds, news cycles, digital libraries, cloud servers, would vanish in a long power outage or a few centuries of neglect. Silicon chips don't fossilize. Fiber optic cables don't become sacred relics. Even our skyscrapers aren't built like pyramids. They're meant to be impressive now, not indestructible later. That doesn't mean we should start hauling 70-ton stones up hills. But it does mean we might want to borrow a mindset from the people who did. Think in deep time. The builders at Giza weren't just working for a paycheck. They were working for a timeline where they personally didn't matter, but the message did. We rarely do that. Our systems reward short-term wins. Elections, quarters, trends. Deep time doesn't care about any of that. The people behind Giza accepted a harsh truth. We won't be here when this is really understood. Build it anyway. There's a kind of faith in that. Not religious faith necessarily, but faith in a future audience. Faith that someone, someday, will stand where you're standing, look up at the same stars, and want to know. They built for that person, for you, for anyone who'd show up thousands of years later and say, "What were you trying to tell me?" So ask yourself, if someone walked through the ruins of our world 10,000 years from now, what would they learn? Would they see an intelligent species that cooperated to protect its world, or a clever species that burned through everything and left a thin layer of plastic and radiation in the rocks? Would they see monuments to fear and power, or monuments to knowledge and connection? Would they see anything at all? From the perspective of the Giza builders, we are that future. We are the distant inheritors. We are the ones who finally got telescopes, satellites, quantum physics, and climate science. We're the ones who can look at their message and, for the first time, test it. We can confirm that climate does flip fast, confirm that impacts do happen, confirm that sea levels do jump, confirm that the Sahara was once green. We can look at global data and say, yeah, they weren't wrong to be worried. We're also the first humans with the ability to see incoming threats in space before they happen. We can track near-Earth objects. We can model orbits. We can think about deflection, evacuation, mitigation. No previous cycle on this planet had that chance. So the question isn't just, did an advanced civilization exist before the pharaohs? The deeper question is, if they could speak to us now, what would they want us to do with what they left? Would they want us to argue endlessly about whether Khufu or somebody older laid the first stone? Or would they want us to say, okay, point taken. This system is fragile. Let's not sleepwalk through it. When you look at Giza as a survival message, 3 themes jump out. 1, respect the sky. Not in a horoscope way, in a physics way. They encoded star positions because the sky is both a clock and a threat. We are finally in a position to do something about that threat. We can support surveys that map near-Earth objects. We can prioritize planetary defense as seriously as we prioritize, say, streaming services or weapon systems. If our ancestors nearly died from falling ice and rock, the least we can do is keep an eye out. 2, respect the planet. The Egyptians wrapped this in the language of Ma'at: balance, truth, rightness. We wrap it in words like sustainability, climate stability, and carrying capacity. Same idea. You push a system too hard, it pushes back. The younger Drya's impact might have been cosmic, but the flood that followed, the climate chaos, the extinctions, those were amplified by a stressed, already changing world. Today, we're the stress. We're nudging climate, biodiversity, and oceans out of their normal bounds. We don't need a comet to have a bad time. We can crash this on our own. Giza whispers, it doesn't take much to tip the balance. Don't assume you're immune. 3, respect memory. The pyramids aren't about kings. They're about memory. Memory of a green Sahara that no longer exists, a sky layout that no longer exists, a world that almost no longer existed. We don't have to copy their architecture, but we can copy their insistence on not letting hard-won lessons vanish. That means keeping critical knowledge in multiple formats, including low-tech, durable ones, teaching long-term thinking, not just what's on the test, preserving not only data but context, so future generations don't just inherit facts, but meaning. Imagine if, before the younger Dryas, there had been a global culture with observatories, mathematics, stone records. We'd be sitting here today, not guessing at what happened, but reading their equivalent of a how-to manual. What they tried, what worked, what failed. Instead, we got fragments. We got myths. We got stone puzzles like Giza. It's better than nothing, but we're capable of more. And that's where this story stops being just a cool theory about the past and starts becoming a challenge to the present. We're standing at a threshold they might recognize. Not because a comet is definitely inbound, though we know objects are out there, but because our entire system is strained. Population, energy, climate, tech, geopolitics, all tightly coupled, all capable of surprising us. We don't get to choose whether we're in a story about risk. We are, but we do get to choose what kind of characters we are. We can be the ones who ignore the signs, laugh at long-term warnings, and assume the party never ends. Or we can be the ones who say, somebody built a stone library 12,000 years ago, and we're the first people with the tools to really read it. Let's not waste that. When you understand Giza as a potential message from a previous cycle, it doesn't make the world scarier. It makes it sharper. It turns the pyramids from tourist backdrops into something more like a conversation. A conversation across time between people who lived through a near extinction and people who are powerful enough to prevent or soften the next one. Us. In the final part, we'll go back one more time to that pre-dawn moment on the plateau. Because there's one more piece to this story. Not just what they did, but what we do next. You're back on the plateau. Last time, the sky is that deep electric blue that only exists in the minutes before dawn. The stars are fading, but not yet gone. The pyramids are dark shapes against the horizon. Still, immovable, like they've decided to be here, and nothing is going to argue them out of it. To your right, the Sphinx crouches in its trench, half earth, half sky, eyes locked on the eastern horizon. You know more now. You're not just looking at old stuff. You're looking at the physical residue of a message carved by people who lived through a world we can barely imagine. A green Sahara, rivers where there's now sand, skies split by fire, floods that redrew the map, ice returning when it should have been retreating. You know the science, The younger dryas impact, the climate whiplash, the mass extinctions. You know the geology. Rain sculpted limestone around the Sphinx. Sediment cores that prove the desert was once alive. The water stains written into rock. You know the astronomy. The pyramids matching Orion's belt as it appeared 12,500 years ago. The Sphinx greeting Leo at the equinox in an epic long before the pharaohs. You know the myth. Zep Tepi, the first time the Benben rising from the flood, the gods walking the earth not as metaphors, but as the deified memory of survivors. You know the pattern. Giza is not alone. Gobekli Tepe, Baalbek, Yanaguni, Sacsayhuaman. Stones that don't fit neatly into our linear story of primitive to advanced. And now, standing here, you know the real question isn't, did a super advanced Atlantis build the pyramids? The real question is, what were the people who built this try and tell the future? Because whoever they were, Egyptian ancestors, a lost culture, some blend of both, they put a staggering amount of effort into making sure something survived. Not their names, not their politics, not their petty dramas. Their knowledge, their experience, their warning. We got it in fragments. Myths of floods, legends of gods, strange alignments no one noticed for centuries. Geological anomalies that only made sense once we drilled ice cores and fired satellites into orbit. In other words, the message waited until we were ready to read it. Now we are, and buried under all the symbols and data, what it says is pretty simple. The world can change faster than you think. Civilization is fragile. You are not the first to learn this. Don't make the same mistakes. We don't know exactly what their mistakes were. Maybe they overreached. Maybe they ignored their environment. Maybe they were just in the wrong place at the wrong time when a comet decided to visit. But we know what they did in response. They rebuilt. They preserved. They encoded. They refused to let their experience vanish without a trace. And whether you believe every detail of this reconstruction or not, that core idea that human beings in deep prehistory may have tried to communicate across thousands of years, that alone should make you feel very small and very big at the same time. Small, because your life is one grain of sand in a cosmic hourglass. Big, because you are part of a species that can do this. Think about it. You are standing on a planet where, at least once already, a global culture said, we might not survive, but our knowledge can. And they were right. Here you are, thousands of years later, watching a video, listening to this story, trying to piece together what they left. You are literally doing what they built Giza for, remembering. We tend to think of ancient people as superstitious, obsessed with death, ruled by irrational fear. Maybe they were more clear-eyed than we are. Maybe they looked at the sky, the climate, the chaos, and thought, we need to build something that lasts longer than any one lifetime. We need to leave a signal in a bottle. We need to talk to the future. They didn't know if that future would ever arrive. They didn't know if we'd make it through our own crises. But they carved anyway. They dragged stone anyway. They aligned to the stars anyway. Because that's what humans do at our best. We build for things we will never see. We plant trees whose shade we'll never sit under. We launch spacecraft that will drift past other stars long after our names are dust. We write, carve, code, compose, not just for now, but for someone else. Someone later. Someone like you. The first edge of the sun touches the horizon. The Sphinx is staring straight at it. For a few seconds, everything goes golden. The faces of the pyramids catch light in distinct planes. The crisp geometry that was hidden in darkness suddenly pops into 3D. This is what the builders obsessed over. The moments when sky and stone and light line up in a way that screams. This is not random. Somebody did this on purpose. You can almost feel them, those long-gone engineers and priests and stonemasons, watching from some unimaginable distance in time, hoping somebody would stand where you are and see. Not just see rocks. See intent. See pattern. See warning. See hope. Because here's the twist most apocalyptic stories miss. This isn't just a doom message. It's also a survival message. The pyramids are proof that humans can live through planetary-scale disasters. We can carry memory through bottlenecks. We can start again and still remember what came before. If a civilization, no matter how small or scattered. Rebuild enough to carve this, align this, plan this, then total annihilation isn't a given. We are not as fragile as we feel. We're just forgetful. And Giza is basically a giant stone post-it note saying, don't forget, you've done this before. You can do it again. But maybe this time, don't lose so much. So what do you do with that? You're one person. You can't deflect comets with your bare hands. You can't single-handedly rewrite global policy. But you can do what they did on your scale. You can choose to think longer. Act with deeper time in mind. Care about what outlives you. You can push for knowledge that's robust, not fragile. Systems that can bend without breaking. Infrastructure that isn't purely optimized for now. You can refuse to treat the future as someone else's problem. Because to the people at Giza, we were the future. We were the someone else. And if we're lucky, we're that for someone else too. If anything in this journey shook how you see the pyramids or history or our own moment in time, share it. Not because I need the views. Because they did. Because a culture that carved this much into stone clearly wanted one thing more than anything. To be heard. To be remembered. To matter to someone beyond their horizon. If you want more deep dives into mysteries like this, lost epics, impossible structures, stories history class skipped, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and drop a comment. Do you think the pyramids are just tombs? Or do you think there's something more? And the next time you see a picture of Giza, or stand there yourself, don't just tick it off the bucket list. Take a second, look up at the sky, look down at the stone, and remember, the world ended once. People lived through it. They left you a message. It's carved in star maps and limestone. And if you listen closely, it says, we were here. We understood. We survived. And so can you.